So last week, I was given the opportunity to stream an early access build of Bladesong, an upcoming swordsmithing game by Sun and Serpent Creations. And I really liked it. The game gives you several tools to tweak your swords and a lot of finer control once you really figure out the systems and quirks. So I'm going to show you the basics of making a sword, fiddling with some finer details, and the general controls of Bladesong so that you are fully equipped to jump in and start making all the swords you like. So when you open the game, you're going to get this menu. The only button you really need to worry about right now is creative mode, although there are buttons here and here for the Discord and the Steam page should you wish to join them and keep up with the game, as well as this is a handy button if you would like to tell the devs what you would like to see added to the game in future, styles of sword, features, parts, that kind of thing. Hitting creative mode will bring you to this main screen. Hitting Forge Blade will let you do just that, whereas Paste Magic Words is where you'll be able to paste a link you'll get from within the sword making screen to share swords amongst friends, other people in the community, whoever you want really. Hitting Forge Blade will bring us into the sword creation interface. Let's talk about a few things on this screen before we start putting hammer to metal. When you open the game, you will very likely have a tutorial in the bottom right. I'd recommend going through this tutorial. It offers a very basic understanding of several of the game's systems, and then coming back to this video when you need a visual guide for the things you are doing. If you should ever close the tutorial or lose it by accident, you can get it back very easily by hitting escape and just pressing show tutorial. Here in the top right of the screen, you can see we have 3 buttons we're going to talk about now and 3 buttons we're going to save for when we're making a sword. This first button, with a picture of a camera on it, toggles object mode. This changes you from rotating the sword in the air like this, to placing the sword on a flat plane and allowing you to rotate the camera around it. This second button, with a picture of a tree on it, allows you to change the plane your sword is placed on to things like an anvil, wooden flooring, cloth, tile, then back to the grid. These first 2 buttons are really good for getting a good look at your sword when you're crafting it, but also for using this third button, which is for really pretty screenshots. You've got a button up here to take photos and a button here to change where they're saved. Finally, to control your camera in this scene, use the right mouse button to rotate around, the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, and middle mouse to slide along the length of the blade. So when it comes to actually making your sword, you're going to start out with this simple billet and tang, and your only option to start is to use this draw out ability to set the length of your blade. To do this, click draw out, and take this red line and drag it until the metal is at a length you are happy with. If you want a bit more precision with the length of your blade, there are 1 or 2 tricks you could do. First of all, you can hit this middle button up top here with the cross guard on it, and then add a simple guard and grip. I like this square cross guard for its simplicity. The way you add these is you click them in the menu here, you drag them in, you get them up to these orange arrows, left click, and they just snap nicely into place. I would use this first grip for a nice simple look, and that gives you a very basic sense of scale for your sword. If you wanted to make a larger two-handed sword, for example, you may need to snap on a second hilt or scale up the one you have, but since we're going to be making a very simple straight sword today for the sake of ease, we don't need that. The other method for determining the length of your sword is also very simple. First, we can click this image of a sword tip to get back to our blade controls. And then if you hit this 5th button up in the top right, that activates the cross-section display, which is an incredibly helpful little screen. Firstly, it shows you, like you would expect, the cross-section of the sword, which for us is this big square right now because we just have a hunk of metal. It also gives you this handy black marker, which follows your cursor along the blade. This is the part of the sword your cross-section display will show you. So if you had a sword that was thinner here, thicker there, you could scroll this along and the cross-section display here would change. Other useful things in this screen include the mass of the sword or its weight, its point of balance, which is this blue line here, right there. It shows you its width, which is this way, its thickness, which is this way, its area, which is the width times the thickness, These red lines are the forward and aft pivot points. And all of these are going to be really useful in later stages of development when you are fulfilling customer requests, meeting certain specifications, that kind of thing. But for now, what we are after is the blade length. So we can see our sword is about 47 centimeters. And I know from Wikipedia is that a one-handed blade that a knight might carry is around 70 to 80 centimeters. So we can click our draw out ability up here, grab this red line again, and just drag that out to about 75 cm. There we go. So those are two ways to get your length to a place you are happy with. And now we can start making a sword. Now that we have our length figured out and our handy display open, we can start using some of these other abilities to have our sword shape start coming together. First up is flatten. Now, we can demonstrate how most abilities in Bladesong are controlled using flatten. To apply the ability, click flatten up here on the left, and then it appears over here on the right in our applied abilities, but you can see it's at 0%. To change this, you grab this red line running along the length of the blade, and you drag it up to increase, down to decrease. You can see when we drag it up to about 70%, we get a much flatter blade, and this is reflected in our cross-section display. This outline here, the blade's mass and its thickness have all changed to reflect what we've done to the metal. However, we can actually alter the effect with even finer controls. For example, we can take, just like in our draw out, these red lines at the end, and we can drag them in to affect where on the sword the flatten is applied. So now it's only being applied from here to here, and this part of the sword is at 0% flatten, and this part of the sword is at 71% flatten. And let's say you did want your sword to be strangely blocky, but you didn't want the effect to just suddenly end so suddenly. You could grab one of these white blend nodes and drag that out. Now you see the blade gradually flattening out from the edge of the effect to where we placed the white node. Using these controls, we can apply specialized, powerful effects to the swords in specific locations at very granular levels of strength. Bonus tip, I didn't even know this before talking to the devs about making this video, but you can right-click this white node to change the shape of the blend, giving you even more control of the shapes you create. Next up are broaden and narrow, which you can use to control the width of your blade. Once again, being able to control where it affects, how strongly it affects, and should you want the effect to blend. For our purposes, I'm going to broaden the entire blade by about 30%. Now that we have a few abilities applied, let me take a quick second to talk about some controls. You can use your up and down arrow keys to cycle through abilities in your applied abilities list. So you can also just click on them to select, deselect. You can press Control with your up and down arrow keys to rearrange things in the list like this. You can delete an effect in its entirety by pressing Delete on your keyboard. But should you do that accidentally and you want your effect back, you can press Ctrl-Z to undo and Ctrl-Y to redo. Now, if you wanted a blade that changed its width gradually and didn't want to set up a complicated mix of broadening and narrowing and adding blends, Profile Taper is for you. It'll give you a nice, steady change in width for your sword. Really nice for like an S-stock type blade or something like that. You can also invert it by dragging the modifier into the negative to actually make it wider towards the tip. A distal taper works the same way, but for thickness instead of width. Now, historically, some small amount of distal taper is found in the majority of real-world swords and is invaluable to a blacksmith to get the balance of the blade right. So we are going to add a very light, maybe let's go wild. Let's say like 40. Now, just to quickly demonstrate how that has affected the blade, if you watch the cross-section display, as I move along the length of the blade, you can see that box getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the blade gets thinner towards the end. All right, so we have the basic skeleton of a sword here, right? We've got thickness, length, width. Let's make it sharp. You can click this point button to add a point to your sword. You can, again, as usual, change the size and strength of this effect. The intensity, this line, for this ability actually changes the shape of the point. So make sure you play around with it or even layer multiple point effects like this to really get the effect you are looking for. To add a bladed edge, however, you want to hit this cross-section button. Not this cross-section button. I know that's slightly confusing. This cross-section button. This adds a tapered edge to your sword with length and blend controls. So we can have this come all the way down and all the way to the end. And a new type of control, these 3 red circles. This outer circle controls the sharpness. If you need a better look of what this is doing, make sure to check the cross-section display. The inner circle controls the spine width, so this flat part of the blade here. The center circle is used to control the angle of the taper, letting you add convexity, like this, or make a concave hollow ground, is the term blacksmiths use for it. Or you can set it back to normal and have a straight edge. These settings can be a little fiddly, particularly convexity. So, another tip, holding shift while adjusting it, while adjusting almost anything in the game, will allow you to adjust it really finely to make these little tiny micro adjustments to get exactly the blade you want. Now's a good time to mention narrow grind. Unlike regular narrow, which will thin the entire blade kind of like from the spine, right? It thins into the center. Narrow grind actually just eats into the blade and dulls edges from cross sections if they happen to be there. It blunts the edges. So that's the difference in those narrows. Now, when you're applying multiple cross sections to achieve, certain specific effects, some of which were quite common, the order of your layers over here will actually have an effect on the way the abilities appear. So if you see, if I stack all these broadens, I've got this outer one, and then I've got this inner one and a center one, right? You can see they just sort of stack normally. They just kind of add on to the layer above them, right? And reordering them, which you'll be able to tell more easily from the percentages, doesn't change anything. They all just add together, right? So while that doesn't necessarily apply to things like broadens, or to be honest, most of these, what it does apply to is cross sections and fullers. So we've got this cross section, right, along the bottom of the blade. If we were to hit Control Z to bring back the one I just deleted, to set up a second cross section, one that fades in here so we get this nice curved point, and then we end up, so you can see, like, we've got the flat of the blade here, then the top half of the blade's all nice and flat, right? Looks cool, very nice. But if I was to reorder those with control of my arrows, you can see this changes and kind of distorts because now one is on top of the other. Basically, these use something called a normal blend, which means they overwrite each other, whereas all of these other settings use something called a additive blend. They all just add together to build and build and build one big effect. But cross sections and fullers, they will override each other rather than add to each other. However, I will say you can get some really interesting and cool looking designs. Like if I put these back, you know, like that's a cool looking little cross section. And you can do similar things with fullers where they like veer off to the side and go slightly diagonal. So absolutely play around with layering them on top of each other. Just be aware that the order you apply them will affect these view settings. In short, there's not really a wrong way to use cross sections. You really can just kind of drag things around until you get a shape you're happy with. As a bonus tip, if you would like a more rounded point to your sword instead of these very flat planes here, you can grab a second cross section. You can apply it just to the tip. You can drag this taper in. Bring this one up here. Grab this spine width node, drag it all the way in, and then set this to like a rounder taper blend. And then there you go. You've got a nice two-toned flatter point to your sword, if that should be what you wish. So this is all well and good for double-edged swords, but what about a single-edged sword like a katana? Well, if you want to do something like that, you need this fifth button up here. This is our symmetry tool, and it's quite powerful. As you can see right now, it's two parallel lines, and there's two parallel lines along every ability here. That means for all of those abilities, symmetry is being applied evenly to both the left and the right of the sword. If you look at the sword from the hilt, and select your cross section and hit our symmetry button, you'll see that the left or top of the blade no longer has that cross section applied. It's only applied to the right or the bottom of the blade. Another press of this button would toggle our symmetry the other way. One more press brings it back to global application, nice universal evenness. To make something like a katana, we would make this one side only. We would grab a narrow. We would set that to be the top side of the blade, which you can kind of tell at a glance from the way these red lines point. And you would narrow this all the way in to get that katana style blade. Make sure you set this up correctly. You want to make sure that your cross section and your narrow are on opposite sides of the sword. Finally, to really get that katana vibe, we can add a new toy, curvature. Applying curvature lightly to the entire blade with a blend near the hilt will really give you that sort of signature katana bend. Curvature, like most effects, can be applied multiple times to add both curve, which if you want the sword to curve to the left, you drag down, to the right, you drag up, curve, and then recurve. You can use the white blend nodes to gently fine-tune some curves, or you can use any of these red lines to more aggressively, forcefully bend the sword. There isn't much to say about curvature. It's incredibly simple to use and apply, but if you dive into it and mess around with it and learn to use it fully, it can provide you with some very complicated effects. Do not worry, Flamberge fans. You aren't going to have to add 30 curves and then 30 recurves and blends to get the effect you want and make that cool wiggly sword, alright? There is an easier way. Let's talk about adding some finer details. So, as mentioned, to get that Flamberge wave effect, you have a host of options, all of these flamboyance options down this side. Flamboyance 1, as shown here, bends the blade, giving that serpent-like curvature along it. Large, it's quite subtle bends, whereas coming down to, say, small flamboyance 1 makes them much tighter and shorter, almost more like teeth along the edge of the blade. Flamboyance 2, however, adds waves by cutting into the side of the blade. You can see it kind of flattens these parts out here. A way to think about it is that Flamboyance 1 curves the center, the spine of the blade, whereas Flamboyance 2 curves the edges. It's worth mentioning now that because Flamboyance 1 bends the center of the blade, you cannot currently apply any symmetry to it, because it's the center of the blade, right? It's already dead center. It's symmetrical by its nature. Flamboyance 2, however, you can. Moving on to fullers. These also cannot have symmetry applied, but that's okay for some reasons we'll get to later. As you can see, they have the usual red line, white node controls, but they also have some controls similar to a cross section. This blue circle can be used to control the position of the fuller, left or right along the blade. If you get it off center and hate it, and it's driving you insane, you can either, again, hold shift to try and drag it very small amounts. And I would say you could try and use this red line along the center of the blade to line it up again, right? Or you could delete the fuller and apply a new one, and it'll be dead center again. You could also, if the last thing you did was move the fuller, is just hit Control Z and it will go nice back to where it was. It's also worth mentioning that a fuller will not apply over a cross section. They will only apply to the spine of the blade, this flat part here. Onto the controls, this outer red circle is used to control the width of the fuller, and this center red circle is used to control the depth. Keep an eye on your cross-section display, because as you can see here, we can basically make the two, like the top and the bottom of the sword, touch this way. So keep an eye on that to really make sure you're getting the shape you want to get. You can control the length and intensity of the fuller in the usual ways, dragging this line out, tapering it in, changing the shape of the taper, you know, really getting that effect you want. If you want 2 or even 3 fullers, side fullers are your friend. Side fullers work almost exactly like regular fullers, but the effect applies the fullers off center to the blade. You can move them in and out. You can change the width of them. All the same as before. Symmetry does work on side fullers. So you could have them on one or both sides of the blade, like this, or even alongside a central main fuller. However, as I said before, much like a cross section, fullers are normal blend. They will overwrite each other. So if we have this fuller slightly off center here, and I try and apply another fuller, and let's say I move it further up, you can see that they kind of become one. There isn't really a way to have them alongside each other. That's what side fullers are for, and rearranging them will move things around, right? But like I said, you can also get some really interesting shaped fullers by doing it this way. Like if I now take this one and make that one thinner, we have this really interesting sort of diagonal zigzag fuller, which you could use to add a lot of weird detailing to things, and maybe go for like a more sci-fi cyberpunk kind of feel to your weapon, you know? So the very last thing we have here is polish blade. This does exactly what it sounds like it should. You add it, you control the intensity, and you can make a real shiny sword. You can, as always, like if you wanted a duller sword, like, say if you wanted the sword to look kind of well used, you could have it be, you know, more degraded near the tip. But otherwise, it is just sheen on the blade. I personally like to add this last because I think the blade is actually so shiny, it's kind of hard to see what you're doing sometimes. So make sure this is like the last detail you add, because otherwise you're going to constantly be turning it on and off so you can see what you're doing. Clicking on this button again, it's finally time to get back into a hilt. Hilts are very, very simple to handle in Bladesong. You've got guards, grips, pommels, and then aesthetic miscellaneous items. You can clip these together basically however you like. You can just use these orange arrows to position things. You can, you know, we've got guard, grip, pommel. We could add another guard in there, which, you know, if you were going for like the way some Zweihanders kind of look, this could be good. Basically, you can clip these together any way you like. There are set ones, like there's this one, rough cross, you know, some rounder ones, katana, suba, for those that are making one of those. But these centerpieces, centerpiece ridge and centerpiece flat, these are handy because these ones, you've got these arms, these tendrils, and these caps and a side ring, and the centerpiece pieces you can actually attach pieces to make things of your own design. You can scale these items up by holding W, scale them down by holding S. You can cycle through items with Q and E. You can rotate them with A and D. You can rotate them more finely by holding Shift when you do this. Same for scaling things up. You can scale them a lot slower if you're holding Shift. If you want a copy of a piece you have, you can shift click it. If you shift click to place it, you'll get to just keep adding more and more and more for as long as you want, basically. And you really can get kind of crazy with it if you feel like it. We got a whole basketball hoop attached to this sword now. If you want to remove a piece from your hilt, it's as simple as clicking the piece, dragging it off, and left clicking again. And you can just very quickly remove parts as you need to. To make a hilt for us here, I'm going to add this Malchus piece. I'm going to add riser underneath it, just because I like the way that looks. I'm going to add one of these twisted handles, just to, you know, kind of show you some of the decoration you can do. I'm going to grab one of these iron ferrules, which is a bit too big, so I'm going to shrink it down, and then we will add a pommel. I think this round one would... Oop, that's another feature. You can just slot these between pieces rather than having to pull things off and replace them. You just hover on the orange arrow you want and it will go there. Down here in miscellaneous, there are also things like you can add spikes to the blade or the handle. There are studs, pyramids, a lion emblem. There are also these runes, which you can use to engrave your sword. There is unfortunately currently no way to change the color of these runes at time of recording. You know, you can write whatever you want on it. These are also useful for shift clicking. You can, so say you scaled this one down, right? And you rotate it around to sit it along so it fit here, right? And then you went to grab your next letter and oh, it's wrong again. This is where the shift clicking comes in very useful. It will remember how you have modified the thing you are shift clicking. And that makes that very nice and easy to do. Last but not least, there are materials down here. So let's say we wanted a lion medallion on the bottom of our sword here, right? Let's say we wanted a pyramid down here in the center of the pommel, right? Let's take a look at some of these materials. So you've got rough steel, brushed steel, polished brass, gold. That's it for metals. But for other things, you've got woods, wire wraps, and it really is as simple as just left click, drag them on, left click again. And we can make this whole thing wood if you wanted. And you can apply this to a lot of things. You cannot apply materials to the blade at time of recording. But let's take a real quick look to say, let's make this some bright red, some polished brass metalwork. Maybe actually silver on these bits and gold on the rings. Nice gold metal. I nearly forgot, but there are also these, I guess you could call them experimental materials, right? Down here, which make things glow super bright. So not exactly practical for what we've tried to make today, but you could use these to, like, you know, add a little dome to a blade, make it glow blue, and try and make some sort of sci-fi cyberpunk looking weapon, right? Hey, me again. One more bonus tip. So, if you're planning on doing some messed up stuff for your sword, and you're worried that, you know, you're going to have to undo it all, you're going to have to break it all, what you can do is, you can grab the magic words, you can come out, paste them, conjure, and now you have a copy of your sword. So you could come into this one, and you could, you know, you could curve it, you could add a bunch of flamboyance, you know, add a third cross section, because why not? You know, you just want to really mess with it. You'll narrow it, and you're like, oh, I hate it, but I have to undo so much stuff now. Beautiful fresh copy waiting there for you. You can use that to make basically backup saves of your work. The game's very lenient and forgiving with mistakes you can make, but that's a helpful tip. And that's basically it. That's everything you would need to know to go and get started making swords in Bladesong. We didn't make the most beautiful sword in the world, but we made a simple sword that you could probably expect to make within your first 15-20 minutes with the game. For example, here's a sword my friend showed me that he made with his first 20 minutes in the game, and his only experience with it had been watching my stream I did. I hope this guide helped to show you basics of how the tools work, how everything fits together, and inspired you to go and make some swords of your own. Don't stop there though. The system is incredibly malleable, and when you get your hands on it, you can do some truly crazy stuff. You can, you know, make different types of swords by, like, you can make an incredibly flat, narrow blade with like a really aggressive convex cross section to make like a rapier. You can stack a ton of grips end to end to make like a spear, and you can get crazier than that. I personally made a Bowie knife, an Uruk-Hai Chopper. I've seen screenshots of lightsaber hilts, axes. I've seen a metal frog. So I literally just finished recording for the night, right? And I opened Twitter, and the very first thing I see, someone made a goddamn hearse in Bladesong. Like, a whole car. How'd they do that? How'd they do that? So, yeah, you can do whatever you want in this system. I feel like by the end of the playtest, we're going to find out that Bladesong can run Doom. So really do go crazy, experiment. Once you've made your weapons, you can take screenshots like I showed you. You can show off your swords, or I'd really love to see some magic words posted in the comments down below. If this video helped you make a sword, I want to see that sword. So please, absolutely share those with me. I really do hope it was helpful. I've never made something like this before. I don't know if I'll ever make something like this again. Thank you to the Bladesong team for giving me a code to play the playtest a little bit early. That was incredibly cool of them, because I'm a very, very small new content creator, and they've been wonderful to work with. Hey, so I spent roughly 20 hours making this video. It's currently late Tuesday night. I started scripting on Sunday. Spent like 5 hours on that, 8 hours editing, like 5 hours recording and re-recording. So if you liked this video and it helped you out, I would really, really appreciate it if you liked it, if you showed it to anyone you know who maybe wants to get into Bladesong. If you subscribe, that would be cool too, but I'm not going to push my luck. But I did spend like 20 hours on this over the course of the last like 2 days, while also doing a 5-hour stream, and having to learn a lot of the editing as I went along. So I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching. Peace.